of people are doing unbelievable things in our country, and sometimes they do it under a blanket almost, undercover.
Hundreds of people are doing unbelievable things in our country, and sometimes they do it under a blanket, almost undercover. At his peak, Cliff Richard was one of the biggest stars Britain had ever seen, commanding stages and capturing hearts across the globe. For decades, he was the voice of joy, the symbol of decency, a figure so carefully constructed and maintained that it seemed almost untouchable. Something to be theatrical. It depends on how your back is. I used to have trouble with the lower part of my back. These words, spoken in a moment of vulnerability, hint at the physical toll that decades of performance would exact. The man who never seemed to fall, who appeared invincible in the public eye, faced a reckoning that would test everything. But in a matter of hours, everything came crashing down when he found himself at the center of the biggest scandal of his life. What followed was a devastating period that nearly broke him. A period that would challenge not just his reputation but his very sense of self. He tried to rebuild and move forward with the same determination that had carried him through 6 decades of stardom. Yet something fundamental had shifted. I didn't think I'd ever do an album where I'd be singing brand new songs again because that seemed to be way past me. These words, spoken during his attempt at artistic resurrection, reveal the depth of the crisis he faced. But nothing ever felt the same again. The world he knew had been irrevocably altered, and recovery became not about returning to what was, but finding a way to exist in what remained. And now at 85, unmarried, childless, and facing a heartbreaking health challenge, things aren't looking so good for the man who once dominated the entire entertainment industry. Yet still he performs. The rise of Cliff Richard is a story of transformation, ambition, and relentless determination. Most people describe Cliff Richard as Britain's polite answer to Elvis Presley, a comparison that captures both his cultural significance and his role as a distinctly British alternative to American rock and roll excess. He has sold more than 250 million records, placing 68 singles in the British top 10, and received a knighthood from the Queen. Honors that reflect not just commercial success but recognition of his cultural contribution. For 6 decades, his voice has been one of the most familiar sounds in popular music, recognized instantly across continents and generations. But the man who sang about joy and celebration has lived a life marked by a loneliness most people would never imagine. A paradox that would define his existence far more than his commercial achievements. Cliff Richard was born on October 14, 1940 in northern British India, where his life began in relative comfort and security. His father, Roger Oscar Webb, managed a catering contractor that serviced the Indian Railways, providing the family with a stable middle-class existence. His mother, Dorothy Marie Dazzely, raised Cliff alongside his 3 sisters, Joan, Jackie, and Donna, instilling values that would guide him throughout his life. The family lived comfortably enough by the standards of the time, but that security rested on a government structure that was already beginning to crumble beneath the weight of changing political circumstances. When Indian independence came in 1947, the family faced a choice that thousands of British families in India had to make. A choice that would reshape their entire lives. Stay in a country that no longer wanted them or return to a homeland most of them had never really known. The decision was agonizing but ultimately clear. They chose to leave. They sold their belongings, packed what remained into trunks and cases, and boarded a ship called the SS Ranchi for a grueling 3-week voyage across the Arabian Sea to Tilbury, Essex. This journey represented not just a change of location but a complete rupture from everything the family had known. But the England they found was not the England they had seen in postcards and heard about in stories. There was no warm welcome waiting at the docks for returning colonials. There was only a semi-detached house in Chulton, Surrey, where Cliff's maternal grandmother took them in temporarily, offering shelter but not comfort. From relative wealth in India, they had descended into something closer to survival in post-war Britain, a Britain still rationing food and rebuilding from the devastation of World War II. The shock of this transition could hardly be overstated. Eventually, the family moved to a 3-bedroom council house in Chesant, Hertfordshire, and that's where the true hardship began. This move to a working-class neighborhood marked their final descent into a reality far removed from their former life. Cliff shared a bedroom with two of his three sisters in close, cramped quarters, and money was so tight that the family developed a specific strategy to stretch every penny. 3 times a week, dinner consisted of nothing but hot tea and toast sprinkled with sugar, a meal that provided minimal nutrition but maximum filling. That meal was not a treat or a nostalgic memory to be fondly recalled later, nor was it a temporary measure. It was the only thing they could afford, and it represented the harsh mathematics of poverty in post-war Britain. This experience of scarcity, of having to make do with almost nothing, would shape Cliff's character in ways both visible and invisible, instilling in him a work ethic and gratitude that never fully left him. Education provided a pathway out of these circumstances. Cliff attended Cheshunt Secondary Modern School from 1952 to 1957, where he placed in the top stream and stayed beyond the minimum leaving age to pass his GCE Ordinary Level examination in English literature. This achievement was significant for a boy from a working-class background, demonstrating both intellectual capacity and determination. Outside the classroom, he excelled at athletics, playing football for his school and eventually for the county of Hertfordshire, a distinction that marked him as physically gifted and coordinated. But the thing that truly grabbed hold of him was music, specifically the American rock and roll he heard on records that seemed to arrive from another world entirely. His parents thought it was a dreadful noise, raw, undisciplined, and culturally suspect, but Cliff thought it was the future. The contraband records that reached British ears in the early 1950s carried something revolutionary, a promise of freedom and excitement that spoke directly to his youthful imagination. When he was 16, his father bought him a guitar, an act of reluctant support that would prove transformative, a small gesture of parental compromise that would change the entire trajectory of his life. Not long after receiving his guitar, Cliff left school and took a job as a filing clerk in an electrical factory where his father also worked. But the job was just a way to pass the time, a means of earning pocket money and appearing to follow the expected path of young working-class men. His mind and his heart were elsewhere. In 1957, he formed a school vocal harmony group called the Quintinonies with 2 other boys and 3 girls, performing cover versions of current hits from America and Britain. He sang briefly with the Dick Teague skiffle group before deciding to form his own rock group, which he called the Drifters. The name would soon become a problem when a legitimate American group claimed it, forcing a change. But first came a much bigger change. At his manager's request, he changed his name from Harry Webb to Cliff Richards to suit the music industry's expectations, a transformation that was both practical and symbolic, marking his rebirth as an entertainer rather than a factory worker's son. His first major gig came in 1958 at the Regal Ballroom in Ripley, Derbyshire, a venue that would have seemed impossibly grand to the young man who had grown up in poverty. But the real breakthrough arrived on July 24 of that year at Abbey Road Studios, in the heart of London's music industry. The producer, Norrie Paramore from EMI's Columbia label, had heard Cliff and invited him to audition. The plan was to record an American tune called Schoolboy Crush as the A-side with a song called Move It, tucked away on the B-side. A standard arrangement where the main commercial hope lay with the cover version. Schoolboy Crush took nearly 2 hours to record, as producer and artist worked to capture the right feel. Move It, written by Ian Samuel, took less time and produced a sound that left no room for doubt about its potential. The recording captured something raw and authentically British about rock and roll, a sound that was neither slavish imitation of American models nor folk tradition, but something new. Move It reached number 2 on the UK singles chart in the autumn of 1958, and British rock and roll had its first homegrown star. The B-side had become the A-side in the minds of listeners and radio programmers, a reversal that signaled something important about what audiences wanted. From there, the achievements came faster than anyone could track. He would eventually make the UK singles charts in every one of its first 6 decades, a feat shared only with Elvis Presley, a distinction that placed him in the rarest company. He would stack up 68 top 10 singles and 14 number ones, including 4 Christmas number ones, more than any other artist in British history. These numbers represented not just commercial success but a kind of cultural permanence, a presence in the lives of multiple generations. But none of that success fixed what was quietly broken underneath the surface. The polite smile and the flawless suits covered a personal life that never found the same kind of victory. The image was carefully maintained, polished, and presented to the world, but behind it lay a different reality. And in August 2014, everything Cliff Richard had spent decades building came down within a matter of hours. In one day, a reputation constructed over 56 years would be damaged in ways that no amount of subsequent vindication could fully repair. The lowest moment of his life arrived without warning, without preparation, and very publicly. In August 2014, Cliff Richard was in Portugal on holiday when he turned on a television and watched police officers search his home. He had not been told the search was happening, nor had he been told why it was occurring. He learned about it the same way millions of viewers did, through live coverage broadcast from a helicopter hovering above his apartment, a surreal and nightmarish intrusion into his private life. The story that led to that moment began nearly 30 years earlier in 1985 at a football stadium in Sheffield. Bramall Lane, the home of Sheffield United, was hosting an event led by American evangelist Billy Graham, an occasion that drew thousands seeking spiritual renewal. Among the crowd that day was a teenage boy who would years later make a horrifying allegation against Cliff Richard, claiming inappropriate behavior during a backstage encounter. For a public figure who had built his entire career on a clean-cut, family-friendly image, the accusation alone carried the potential to destroy everything he had constructed.